Before sewing became technique, before it became pattern, precision, or fashion, it was gesture, a slow gesture, done by hands that loved more than they hurried. There's something sacred about the first time someone places a needle in your hand, especially when it's your grandmother. This story isn't about stitching clothes. It's about stitching time, stitching memory, stitching the soul back together. If you've ever held a thread and didn't know what to do with your own knots, this story is for you. So get cozy, let your heart breathe a little, and if at any moment this story brings up a memory of your own, leave a comment. Tell me what you remember. Like, share, and subscribe so we can keep sewing stories like this one together. Because every story is a thread, and every memory an embroidery in time. And every memory an embroidery in time. Let's baste this here. That's how it all began, with a simple phrase spoken by a voice I loved before I even knew what love really was. I must have been around 8 years old, sitting on Grandma's porch, feet still dirty from the street, a white cloth on my lap, and a heart already wanting to run out into the world. She handed me a thick needle, light blue thread, and a piece of raw cotton marked with hand-drawn chalk lines. I looked at it like it was a mystery. "What is this?" I asked. She smiled. That smile only grandmothers have, the kind that comes from someone who's lived a lot, but still has the patience to teach gently. She showed me how to pass the needle through, from one side of the fabric to the other. Big stitches, loose, just marking the path. Nothing permanent yet. It was just practice, a sketch, a whisper before the shout. "This is called basting," she said. "Say it with me, basting." I repeated it, more than once, like it was a magic word. She continued, "Basting helps us see if something's right before we lock it in. It's how we feel, how we adjust. Then we stitch it for real." That stayed with me, because until then, beginning meant rush. It meant someone shouting, an adult demanding. But with her, the beginning was an invitation. It wasn't, "Hurry up." It was, "Sit here with me." It wasn't, "Do it right." It was, "Let's see how it turns out." And while I fumbled with the needle, stitching more wrong than right, she reminded me, things done with calm last longer. I looked at those loose stitches and thought, this won't hold anything. But she'd say, it's in the temporary that we test our intentions. That's when I learned basting wasn't about holding anything together. It was about trying, about having space to breathe. If a stitch didn't land right, you could just pull the thread and start again. No guilt, no punishment, no fear. She told me, life needs basting too. Before we make decisions, before we speak in anger, before we judge someone. Baste first, mark the place, feel it out, because afterward, my dear, real stitching is forever. That afternoon lasted forever in my memory. The smell of the porch wood, the sound of the street, the crackle of the old radio inside, and me with fabric in my lap, learning that loose stitches can hold more than you think. They hold time. They hold love. They hold who we are. The blue thread disappeared between my fingers. The needles slipped more than once, and the white cloth slowly began to show timid markings, like a skin that didn't yet know what it was going to be. My grandmother watched with a calm gaze, that kind of look that doesn't correct. It welcomes. It waits. She didn't say much. Sometimes she'd simply rest her finger on mine, guiding the thread, like someone leading an old, quiet dance. "See this stitch here? It's trying to run, but sewing that runs breaks." And that's when I understood. Sewing was a form of listening. Listening to the fabric. Listening. listening to the thread, and mostly listening to yourself. Time began to slow down. The heat of the afternoon faded into a warm breeze, full of the scent of wet earth and fresh brewed coffee. My grandmother got up, went into the kitchen, and returned with 2 glasses of cashew juice and a small plate of Maria cookies. She sat down again. "Good sewing needs a pause," she said. "Once I tried to sew fast, to show her I was ready, that I didn't need help anymore. But the stitches came out uneven, the thread tangled. I got frustrated and began to cry. She didn't scold me. She simply took my hand, gently pulled out the thread, and started over with me from the very first stitch. Basting means starting over without shame. It's rehearsal, not failure. That day she told me that when she was a young girl, she only had 1 skirt for church, and each week she'd baste a new layer on top to make it look like a different outfit. It was all improvised, she said, but it was made with love, and that's what holds things together. Years passed. I grew up. The clothes changed. The pace of life changed too. But whenever life weighed me down, it was the needle I turned to. Instead of shouting back at the world, I'd sit with fabric in my lap and make loose stitches. No goal, just to listen to myself again. One time, already grown and heartbroken, I returned to that same porch. My grandmother was slower now. Her hands trembled, but her eyes still bright. She looked at me like someone who sees your soul and whispered, "Brought any cloth?" I hadn't, but she had. She pulled from her bag a lilac fabric with tiny little flowers and a spool of white thread. "Let's baste what hurts," she said. And so we did. Between loose stitches and sweet cookies, I learned once more. Sewing isn't about fixing. It's about allowing something to begin settling back into place. The sky turned dark slowly. The afternoon breeze grew still, and the porch smelled of night and basil. The fabric, now filled with white stitches, looked like a sky full of stars. She looked at it, sighed, and said, "It's not beautiful, but it's true." And that's the beauty of basting. It doesn't pretend. It doesn't hide. It shows you exactly where you need to look, with a little more kindness. She held my hand, me already a grown woman, as if I were still that 8-year-old girl. And she said, "Before you stitch life together, you have to baste your heart." That night, she folded the cloth, put away the thread, and told me, "This isn't for wearing, it's for remembering." And I did remember. I remembered myself, small, her hands steady, her soft voice, the scent of her house, the quiet wisdom she sewed into every little point. That night, I went home with something stitched inside me. Every life, to begin beautifully, needs to be basted first, with time, with care, with truth, and with lots and lots of love. For a long time, I believed that beauty was in the tight things, the firm, the straight, the unshakable. Tight stitches, perfect seams, flawless finishes. But my grandmother, she taught me otherwise. She used to say real beauty was in what left room to breathe. That loose stitches told more about a person than any perfect, polished seam ever could. "Basting is honest," she said, as she passed the needle slowly through the cloth. "It's not trying to be the end. It's just there to help the end look better." There were days when I came home quiet, dropped my backpack in the corner, and went straight to the porch. The world felt too heavy on my back, and I didn't even know why. She didn't ask, just pulled out her sewing basket, chose a soft-colored thread, and said, Sit here with me. Let's baste a little. It was her way of saying, I'm here, without pressure. The needle went in and out. And each one time, I was really upset. A fight at school. Mean words thrown my way that I didn't know how to throw back. I arrived home with my face flushed and my pride in pieces. She looked at me gently and said, Today, your thread will be green, to remind you that everything begins again. We started stitching a kitchen cloth. No goal, no purpose, just to let the feelings find their way out, quietly. While we basted, she told me stories. How she once fell off a bike and tore her only good dress. About the time she embroidered through tears because her friend's boyfriend had chosen someone else. About the cloth she stitched for days and then, in a moment of anger, threw into the fire and regretted for months. She sewed and spoke. I listened and stitched. Sewing is sensitive, she said. It feels what we feel. If your heart is restless, the stitches will run wild. And it was true. On the sad days, my stitches were long and uneven, like the uncertain steps of someone who doesn't know where to go. On anxious days, everything came out too tight. The thread stretched until it almost snapped. And on peaceful days, then the stitches flowed like music, soft, rounded, sure of themselves. Your stitches speak before your mouth does, she said. And anyone who learns to listen can understand a lot about life. She taught me to observe the fabric, to listen to the thread, to respect the time. She never said, you did it wrong. She said, this part here is afraid. This one's trying to run away. This one didn't want to stay. And I understood, because deep down, that stitch was me. She kept a little blue notebook where she wrote about my stitches. Not the type of stitch, not the name of the cloth, but the feeling of the day. Today, long stitch, sad day. Today, tight stitch, anger inside. Today, loose and light, a morning with wind and hope. She wrote like someone writing a prayer. It's your diary, she said, in fabric, because sometimes we need to stitch what we can't put into words. With time, I learned that basting was my way of existing more slowly. I learned not to fix everything all at once, to leave room for mistakes, to understand that the temporary can also be beautiful, and that some things inside us only come out when our hands are holding a needle and a cloth that welcomes silence. Years later, I taught my little sister how to sew. She wanted to learn the fancy stitches, the invisible stitch, the kind of seam that looks grown up. But I said, before you run, you have to learn to walk with loose thread. And I taught her the way I had learned, with gentleness, with space, with plenty of extra thread. One windy September afternoon, the clothesline outside. Grandma was sewing near the window, making a dish towel with chickens on it. I sat down beside her and said, I don't want to sew today. I'm tired of everything. She didn't insist. She just left the cloth in my lap, the needle already threaded, and went to make some coffee. I stayed there, staring at that silly-looking chicken, at the wind outside, and the quiet around me. Then my fingers started basting on their own. And when she came back with the coffee, she smiled. Even willingness has its own time. And sometimes it only returns when the hands go first. My grandmother always believed basting was more than a technique. It was a listening, a care, a pause where the heart could breathe. Today, When someone asks me why I still make loose stitches on cloths that have no purpose, I smile and say, because there are still things inside me that can only be said this way, with a loose stitch, soft thread, and the silent voice of my grandmother. Some things in life can't be solved with noise, or speed, or strength. Some things in life can only be healed with long hours of sewing. My grandmother used to say this every time I arrived with my heart all crumpled. Sometimes it was a small hurt. Sometimes it was a sadness I couldn't even name. And often it was just life itself, too heavy. She didn't give long advice or ready-made answers. She'd just pull out a little stool, open her box of cloth, and say, "Let's stitch for a while." Between one stitch and the next, the world tends to realign itself. What she meant by that, I only truly understood much later. Back then, I thought sewing was just something people did when they had nothing better to do. But she knew. She knew sewing was medicine. A quiet kind of prayer. A way of answering the questions our mouths didn't know how to ask. That's when Grandma taught me. The secret is in your breathing. Before every stitch, take a breath. The cloth can feel the breath of the one who sews. From that day on, I stitched while breathing. Pulled the thread gently, inhaled, exhaled as the needle moved again. And little by little, it wasn't the world that adjusted. It was me. One day, she taught me a new stitch. It was called the thorn stitch. Pretty, full of little loops and crosses, but hard to learn. I pricked my finger twice, got frustrated. She looked at me with wise eyes and said, "That stitch is just like you. Like me, beautiful, but stubborn, strong, but slow. If you rush it, it hurts. But if you give it time, it turns into poetry on the cloth." I said nothing. It was the first time I saw myself described in thread. ... And I never forgot that stitch. Over time, I learned to sew in silence, without needing someone to guide me. I learned to prepare the fabric, to choose the right thread, to undo mistakes with care. I even stopped fighting with knots. When they came, I paused, breathed, gently loosened them with my fingers. Because knots, Grandma said, are just stitches that got scared. One day, my mother cried in secret. She didn't say why, but I saw. I went to the drawer, took out the floral cloth, sat at the kitchen table. When she passed by, she saw me stitching and stopped. She sat beside me, said nothing, just looked. "Want to baste for a bit?" She nodded with her eyes, and we stitched together. No explanation, no story. When we finished, she hugged me tight and whispered, "That was all I needed." And I understood that day that between one stitch and the next, the world truly finds its way again. Not everything can be fixed with sewing. Of course not. But when your hands are busy, your heart gets a little rest. And when you sew with someone, the weight divides itself. And somehow, the sadness feels lighter. Today, when the days get heavy, the first thing I do is open my sewing box. I'm not looking for answers, just thread and silence. I pick a fabric, any fabric, and begin. Not to make something beautiful, not even to finish anything, just to breathe and give life a little room to fall back into place. And almost always, it works. Between one stitch and the next, the tears come, then leave. Between one stitch and the next, ideas settle. Bitterness shrinks. Forgiveness gets closer. Between one stitch and the next, I return to myself. Some nights feel endless, and some pain Not even prayer can mend. In that tiny clay brick house, damp and quiet, I learned that when faith begins to flicker, sometimes it's sewing that keeps it going. Grandma used to say that faith doesn't live only in rosaries, not only in church pews, not only in a priest's words. Faith, she said, could live in the needle too, in the thread, in the repeated gesture of someone who waits, who stitches without knowing what comes next. Faith is stitching in the dark, she'd say. Even if you don't know if the cloth will tear, you still sew. I learned this on one of those dark nights. I was still young, but old enough to know something was wrong. The house was quieter than usual. My mother's eyes were swollen. My father didn't speak a word, and my grandmother sat at the edge of the bed with a piece of fabric in her lap, her gaze drifting into nowhere. Rain poured outside, the lights were out, and the candle on the kitchen table trembled like it was afraid to. She called me over in a soft voice. "Come here, child. Let's stitch some hope." I sat beside her, unsure. She handed me a dark piece of cloth, a spool of white. We stitched for hours, the candle our only light, and yet our hands found the path by heart. She was embroidering the name of my aunt, the one in the hospital far away. I only found that out later. That night, the thread held more than fabric. It held pain. It held longing. It held the hope that refused to go out. She didn't cry, but each stitch she made felt like a plea. Come back. Stay. Just hold on a little longer. Even without words, that stitched prayer echoed through every corner of the house. After a while, she sighed and told me a story. Said that when she was a young girl, her little sister got very sick. High fever, delirium. And since there was no doctor nearby, her mother spent the whole night sewing. She embroidered the girl's name onto a pillowcase using red thread. Then she buried it beneath the guava tree in the backyard. It was her way of asking for a miracle, Grandma said. And the fever, it went down. I didn't fully understand, but I kept that story like an old recipe. Because deep down, I knew it wasn't just about healing the girl. It was about believing that a small, loving gesture could move something in the invisible world. A week later, my aunt came back home, weak but alive, and my grandmother tucked away the cloth we had stitched inside her Bible. She said cloth stitched with faith wasn't meant for show. It was meant to remind us. After that day, I never doubted that sewing could be a kind of prayer. Years later, when I lost my first love, it felt like the ground vanished beneath me. Nothing hurt more than that absence. That tearing of plans, of promises, of dreams I had stitched too tightly. I cried for 3 days. Didn't eat. Didn't speak. My grandmother watched from afar, quiet. On the 4th day, she entered my room with a dark cloth and a box of colorful threads. She sat next to me and said, "Pick." I hesitated. Then I chose light blue. She smiled and whispered, "Then let's stitch your way back to yourself." I sewed while crying, hands shaking, heart aching, but I sewed. And stitch by stitch, I started hearing myself again. Faith didn't come back whole, but it returned in pieces, like a loose thread that we slowly learned to tie again. Today, when I see someone disheartened, their gaze far away, chest caved in, I don't offer advice. I offer a needle, thread, and a simple cloth. Just sew for a while, I say, even if you don't know what you're doing. Sometimes faith starts in the fingertips, and it's true. Some people never pray with words, but pray with stitches. Some never set foot in church, but sew the world back together with tenderness. People who, even in the dark, still believe that one thread is enough to begin again. Maybe that's what faith really is. Not something loud, not something fancy. Sometimes faith is just a small act. A soft stitch, a humble cloth, and the courage to keep sewing even when you can't see the end. It was my grandmother who taught me that. And today, every time I thread a needle, I feel like it's her stitching me back together from the inside. In the dark, in the silence, in memory, where faith still sews its way through. Sewing is also about learning how to lose. Learning that no matter how carefully you stitch, sometimes the thread breaks right in the middle, right at the very end. Just when it looked like everything was ready. My grandmother used to say, life does that. Just when you think you've arrived, it comes and undoes a piece. And then we cry. Of course we do. But after that, we tie a knot and begin again. I remember the first time the thread snapped and I cried. It was a kitchen towel with a little embroidered house. I had spent hours on that house. The windows, the flowers, even the roof in a fancy stitch. Right at the end, just the fence left, and the thread broke. I lost it. Threw the cloth on the floor. Grandma didn't scold me. She picked up the fabric, folded it carefully, and said, "The thread snapped, but the fabric's still here, and so are you. So tomorrow, we begin again." I wanted fast comfort, instant answers, but I learned that thread has its own timing, the timing of healing. Some threads break because they're old, but others because we pull too hard. And some stitches fall apart because they weren't meant to hold yet. Once, while stitching my cousin's wedding linen, the thread broke 3 times in the same spot. I got angry. So did she. But my grandmother, with her quiet eyes, said, "Maybe it's not meant to be stitched just yet. Wait a while. Some stitches need to ripen." And that's how it is with everything. With love, with plans, with ourselves. Some things come undone because they need to be sewn again differently. Years later, when life truly knocked me down, when I lost something I thought I'd never recover, it was that memory that saved me. No thread, no cloth, just the image of my grandmother with fabric on her lap, softly saying, "The thread broke, but you're still here. So tie a knot and begin again." So I did, scared, shaky hands, almost no thread left. But I started again. Every stitch after that was made with more care. Not more perfection, but more truth. Knowing the cloth could tear. Knowing the thread could snap. But trusting the will to continue more than the fear to fail. Grandma used to say that tying knots wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Those who know how to tie good knots understand that strong stitches are often full of repairs. Now, when I teach someone to sew, I don't start with fancy stitches. I start with basting. Then I tell the story of the knot. I show how to hold the thread, how to pull gently, how to stop before it's too tight, and if the thread breaks, how to tie a new knot without shame. Some people learn this through sewing. Others on the farm. Some only learn after a long road of sorrow. But all of us, someday, learn that starting again is something done by hand, slowly, stitch by stitch, with short thread and long patience. Some restarts come after loss, after grief, after silence. Some begin when we no longer believe we can, and still we try. We grab what thread is left, pick a new cloth, or the same old one, patched, and we begin again, from the very start. No pride, no pattern, just Cora. My grandmother passed before we could finish a full quilt together, but she left me all the pieces I needed: thread, needles, silence, and bravery. Now, when life tears a hole in me, I sit, breathe, and do what she did. I grab the cloth, choose the thread the needle with care, and tie a knot. A good knot, strong, full of story. Then I go back to stitching, because in the end, what holds us together isn't the perfect seam. It's what we do when the thread breaks. My grandmother passed before we could finish a full quilt together, but she left me all the pieces I needed: thread, needles, silence, and bravery. Now, when life tears a hole in me, I sit, breathe, and do what she did. I grab the cloth, choose the thread the needle with care, and tie a knot. A good knot, strong, full of story. Then I go back to stitching, because in the end, what holds us together isn't the perfect seam. It's what we do when the thread breaks. And if you've made it this far, thank you for listening with your heart. If this story reminded you of someone or of yourself, leave a comment below. Tell me, what memories did this thread bring back today? Like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep stitching stories together with longing, silence, and love. Because every story is a thread, and every memory an embroidery in time. See you next time.